Thanks, Inya. So, again, I'm here to present Translating React, and you can find me at MyBlueWristband on Twitter. And you can find these slides at genzor.github.io/translatingreact. So beyond creating the poop map, you're probably wondering, who am I? So here's a smattering of photos of me with a bunch of animals. I really love animals. I was recently in Mongolia, so you can see I'm riding a horse, a yak, a camel, and also holding a golden eagle. So pretty crazy. But when I'm not hanging out with animals, what do I usually do? So I work as a product engineer for Envoy, and we're hiring. So if you're interested, we hire remote engineers. We love our remote engineers. And then if you happen to be located in San Francisco, here's a smattering of some of the dogs you could hang out with in our office. Okay, so just like Valerie, I'm here to tell you a little story. This one is about switching frameworks at a company where I used to work. So we used to be on Backbone, where I worked, and all of our senior engineers were like, we need to switch frameworks. And they were like, we're going to switch to React. And they were exactly like this. Oh my God, React. They were so excited. And I was like, what is that? And they were like, it's components. And I was like, what is that? But they were like, well, nothing stops this React train. We are switching to React, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I felt like, OK, I guess I'm going along with this. They did a good job of explaining what React was, giving us some tutorials. But I still felt a little bit confused. And I was like, what even is React? And we know we're talking about React.js. So I was like, well, I'll start by going to their website, I guess. And this is what their website looks like. So we all have probably seen this. This is a React conference. So we know that they have really great documentation. There's tutorials, information about getting started. But there isn't really much about the inner workings of React. So they say that React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And they have 3 points on their homepage. Number one is that React is declarative. Basically, that declarative views make your code more predictable and easier to debug. And I was like, OK, that's not bad. Sounds pretty good to me. They also say that React is component-based. And we just mentioned components. And I know a lot of people are tired of the comparison between Legos and components, but I'm not. I love Legos. And then they also say that React, you can learn it once and write it anywhere. And I was kind of like, OK, that's not that exciting to me. And then they also say that you can write React without rewriting existing code. And I was like, but wait a second. I'm rewriting existing code right now. We're going from Backbone to React. So I felt a lot like this, like, OK, sure, not rewriting existing code. But again, nothing stops the React train. So I just started plugging away and typing React without really thinking about what I was writing. So what are some confusing things about React? Or what were confusing things to me when I was starting out with React? Well, honestly, sometimes I just forget that React is JavaScript. Because when people talk about it, they talk about components. They talk about JSX. And they talk about the virtual DOM. But we're really talking about React. We're not talking about all of those things. And then I realized, oh yeah, React is open source. So I was like, oh, I can go to GitHub and look at the entire repository. So that's what I did. So here we see Facebook's React. And you can see there's a packages folder. And I was like, OK, that must be where React is. So here we're in the packages folder. And you can see there's a package called React. And I was like, oh, OK, so let's start here. And then we'll go and take a look at this file in the source called react.js. So we see here, just at the top, there's a bunch of imports. And let's see. I got to get my cursor over here. So there's a bunch of imports. And for some reason, I can't scroll. Oh, because I'm using someone else's, I'm using Robbie's computer and we scroll in different directions, that's why. So, yeah. Okay, so this is all of React. And I was like, oh, that's pretty straightforward. Oh, I gotta come back over here. So that's literally all React is. It's just like this one file. And I was like, okay, that's not too bad. I guess that's not so scary. So it's actually time to get your hard hats on. So everyone have their hard hats? They gave those out earlier, right? Okay, well, if not, just like cover your head, protect yourself, because we're going to do some code spelunking. Okay, so we started out in React packages, React source, React.js. And we can see this React is not actually just that one file. It's a bunch of imports of these modules. It's a lot of stuff. And if we go to, again, the same file, we can see that React, sorry, I'm turning away from my mic. So we can see that React is this object that has children, and then it has a couple of other key value pairs. And that's about it. And then I realized, I was like, oh, that's not so scary. React is actually, it's just an object. And I was like, wow, that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so now that we know what React is, kind of, let's take a look at the basis of React. And what's the basis of React? It's React elements. So if we want to write some React, or we want to create an element in plain JavaScript, we can do it this way. So we grab an element, a root element from the DOM. We create an element using document.createElement. We're going to call it div. We're going to give it some text, and then also give it a class name, protestDiv. And then we append that child element to the root element. That exact same code in React looks like this. So again, we grab a root element. We use React.createElement, and we create a div with a class name and some text content. And then we use React.DOM.render to render that element into the root element. So those two side by side look almost exactly the same. They're doing the exact same thing. And so I was like, well, if that's the case, why do we have React.createElement? So React.createElement, where does it come from? Let's take a closer look and try to find it. So again, we're looking at that same file, react.js, that we saw earlier, and we see that we're importing a few things from this module called React element. So we're moving from React packages, React source, React.js to React packages, React source, React element.js. And in that file, we can see this file, React element.js, and the function create element. So here we can see create element is just this function that takes in type, config, and children. And then it returns a React element. So that's all React or create element is doing, is it's returning this React element to us. Okay, so what is a React element then? So again, we'll take a closer look here. If we look at a React element in the same file, React element.js, we can see that it's a factory method to create a new React element. It no longer uses the class pattern, so you don't need to use the new keyword. Scrolling down the page a little bit, you can see that React element is also a function, and it's a factory. So it's basically creating these elements. You see that it creates a const called element, and inside of the element, you have type, key, ref, and props. And then I realized, I was like, oh, React elements are just another object. But what are all those properties? Going back, again, we have type, key, ref, and props. And I like to say that it's just part of the React magic. So the built-in properties that belong to the element are a type, key, ref, and props. And they come standard with the React library. And that's not something that we can get in vanilla JavaScript. So that's what makes React so magical. But we're just scratching the surface here, and we've come a little bit full circle. So you can see we started with this function, create element, and then it returns a React element. And if we go back to the code we wrote earlier, we're using react.createElement. So we've gone from react.createElement inside of React.js to React.createElement inside of reactElement.js to React element inside of reactElement.js. So we've come a long way, but guess what? There's actually an easier way, and that's JSX. We all love JSX. It's very exciting. So when I first looked up JSX, this is what I found. I found that JSX is a statically typed, object-oriented programming language designed to run on modern web browsers. So it's a faster, safer, easier JavaScript. And I found it at jsx.github.io. But actually, we know this is not the JSX we're looking for. The correct one is actually found on Facebook's site. So I found this JSX specification. It's a draft, actually. Interestingly, neither of these JSXs has a logo, but there is an open issue on the first JSX, and they're like, we don't have a mascot or a logo. So they're discussing it here, and they're like, maybe we want to use a tuna for our logo. And then someone drew this up.
It's the scariest logo.
So if anyone from Facebook's here, maybe you want to have this logo for your JSX before the first JSX grabs it. Anyways, so again, we know that we're actually talking about JSX as in JavaScript XML, which is an XML-like syntax extension to ECMAScript. But really, JSX is actually syntactic sugar for calling React.createElement, which is what we were talking about earlier. And we all love syntactic sugar in JavaScript, right? So it's JavaScript XML, and basically anything you can do in JSX, you can actually do with plain JavaScript, which I'm pretty sure Nir was showing earlier during his talk as well. So JSX and JavaScript, I like to say they're kind of like this. They're like, anything you can do, I can do better. And they're just fighting over who writes what. So how does React work with JSX? Well, React comes with a default set of syntax transformers, and those ship as part of Babel. So if we go to Babel, we can see there's this thing called the Babel plugin transform React JSX. And that's basically how we can transpile React or JSX into React code. So interestingly, when you do use JSX, it actually compiles down to calls to React.createElement, again, what we were talking about earlier. So the React library always needs to be in the scope of your JSX code. So I always say, don't you forget about React. OK, so let's take a quick look at some transpile JSX. So we'll do some Babel transpilation of our original React element. So here I have my HTML syntax, which is actually just JSX. And then we can see that it transpiles exactly to what we were talking about, a call to React.createElement. It's pretty straightforward, but it's an easier, nicer way of writing things. Since we're at a React conference, I think most everyone knows there are protected words in HTML. Because JSX is closer to JavaScript than HTML, React DOM uses camel case property naming conventions instead of the HTML attribute names. So some that I'm familiar with are class name, tab index, things like that. So I was curious about how many protected words there were, because I just knew about a few of them. And then I found this file called possible standard names. And this is what this file looks like. OK, so we're at the top here. These are some of the protected words. We probably just passed class name. Keeps going. It's very long. I'm just going to keep going. And those are all the possible standard names. So it's quite long. Trying to get back over my slides here. It's almost 500 lines. So if you thought you knew all of the protected words, you probably don't. OK, so another thing that used to confuse me about React were the curly braces. I would always get these confused with template literals. So I'd be looking at them like, what are these curly braces? I don't understand them. But inside of that draft specification of JSX, we can see that it's actually an assignment expression or a child expression. So it's basically JavaScript that is inside of JSX. So it's JavaScript living inside of a JSX world. OK, so now that we have an easier way of using React.createElement, let's make some components. This is one of my favorite GIFs on the entire internet, if you couldn't tell. Okay, so React components. So coming back to the react.js file, we can see that component is being imported from this module called React Base Classes. And if we go to React Base Classes, we can see that's where a component's coming from. So this is a function of a React component. Basically, it takes in some props, it takes in context and an updater, and that's basically it. So React components are like, give me my props, which are basically just properties of the component itself. And they're basically, those props are basically just an object argument with some data. So here is our original element, our protest div. And then here is our protest div, which is written as a component instead. So here we're creating this class called protest, which extends our React component. We render it with some props, and the prop here, in this case, is chant. So we can create this element using our class protest, and then we, again, use React DOM.render to render that component to the DOM. So we all know that the difference between a component in React versus an element in React is the ability to take in state. Unfortunately, in this talk, I don't really have a lot of time to get into state, so we'll just stick with props in that case. Oh, dang. Sorry, that one's not running, so I'll just do that. Okay, so now that we have component, let's render it to the DOM. So we keep seeing React DOM.render. And when I first started writing React, I was like, okay, we've got React DOM, we've got all these React things. Why do we need all of these libraries? And then I realized, oh, actually abstraction is important. Because abstraction makes your code more maintainable and sustainable. And abstraction is great, especially when it comes to adorable golden retrievers. Although I don't think abstraction of those guys makes them more maintainable. Anyways, so let's take a look at the package inside of React called React DOM. So here's React DOM. If we scroll down the page to the README, we can see that React DOM consists of three things in its API. We have find DOM node, render, and unmount component at node. So we're going to focus on render here. So render exists inside of React DOM, source, client, React DOM.js. And here's what render looks like. So we see that render returns this function called legacy render subtree into container. And I was like, what is that thing? So again, we're inside of the React DOM.js file. So I'm looking for legacy render subtree into container, and I find that here. So it's another function. And, oops, sorry. If I scroll down the page of this guy, you can see that it returns this thing called DOM renderer. So I was like, what is DOM renderer? So I scroll back up the page, and I can see that everything from DOM renderer is imported from React reconciler /inline.dom. So I go to inline.dom.js inside of React reconciler, and all that's happening is we're exporting everything from React Fibre reconciler. So what is React Fibre reconciler? So we have an idea of what React is, and again, we're at a React conference, so most people probably know what Fibre is, but I didn't at the time. So I found this article in Free Code Camp by Ryan Jurkinen, and he says that React Fibre is just an internal engine change. And in terms of the reconciler piece, he says that React will walk through the virtual tree, find what's changed, and update as little as it can. This could mean updating one class attribute, or it could mean tearing down the entire DOM. And that's what's called reconciliation. So I was like, well, what is Fibre and what is this reconciliation? And again, it's just more of this React magic that's happening. So also, did you know that React actually has some secrets? If it wasn't a secret, or if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret, but I'm going to tell you anyways. So scrolling around the React source code, there's this constant called secret internals do not use or you will be fired. And I was like, ooh, what is that? So we see it here. It's being signed, this thing called React shared internals. So I was like, where does that come from? So I scroll up the page and I see that React Shared Internals is coming from React Shared Internals, the module. So I go into there and I see that the const is being assigned there, and React Shared Internals pulls two things. It pulls React Current Owner and then React Debug Current Frame. So I was like, okay, let's take a look at React Current Owner and see where that is. And then inside of React Current Owner, we can see that we are actually grabbing Fibre and Dispatcher from React Reconciler, which is also the React Fibre and React Fibre Dispatcher. So we've gone from the file React.js to React Shared Internals to React Current Owner to React Reconciler. And what is React Reconciler? Well, their documentation says that it's an experimental package for creating custom React renderers. Its API is not as stable as that of React, React Native, or React DOM, and does not follow a common versioning scheme. Use at your own risk, which is pretty scary. You might get fired, but again, that's just more of the React magic. It's exactly how React renders things. So you can actually grab this React Reconciler and write your own React renderer, which is pretty cool, but also you might get fired if you did that. Okay, so we've come to the end of our talk. And my main message here is that I did a lot of code spelunking. This is just a little bit, though, of what exists in the React code base. So I highly encourage everyone to take a look and go digging into the source code. This way you can be armed for the future if you want to use, and decide if you want to use React or maybe if you don't. So you can be like this hacker. So this is one of my repositories, and there's a pull request on there, and a guy says he's on this React kick, and so he's decided to rewrite my entire repository in React. And I took a look, and I was like, well, my code base is only 250 lines of code, and React is 8,000 lines of code. So because I felt so armed with this new knowledge, I felt very confident to be like, no React this time, but maybe next time. I just wanted to give a big thanks to one of my old coworkers who introduced me to this awesome guide, the Beginner's Guide to React. It's written by Kent C. Dodds. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you.